With rising costs of long-term care in the United States, it's no wonder that this is such a hot topic. And on the financial side of long-term care, the solutions are really few and far between. Find out what you need to know about long-term care next on Consider This Program. Hi, welcome back to Consider This Program. I'm your host, Jamie Burton.
And I'm Darren Hardesty.
It's great to have you here today, Darren.
It's great to be here.
What we are talking about today is really a hot topic. Long-term care is what we are going to be diving into today. And I know in my own personal experience, when I'm having these conversations with my parents, it's such a sensitive topic because my parents have seen their own parents go through it. They have seen the mental decline that happens when you start getting to an older age and you can't really take care of yourself anymore, and you're going to have to make a decision of whether or not you want to go into a long-term care facility where you have other people helping you. And then you have the big decision around, how in the world am I going to pay for this?
Yeah.
And it just keeps getting more and more expensive every year. So it's definitely a big conversation that we're having with our families that are coming in, whether it makes sense to look at insuring ourselves against a possible long-term care event in the future, or if we can really take that discussion off the table a little bit, knowing that our families are more self-insured.
Yeah. Well, and the families we see, typically the answer is, yeah, they probably have enough. But it's definitely it's a concern. And when you say it's a hot topic, when I talk about long-term care at parties, man, people, they love it. So, but it really is a topic that it's becoming more of an issue because people are living longer. And if people are living longer, the need for a long-term care facility is probably going up. I don't have data to back that up, but logically it makes sense. And it's something that's important to people. And I can tell you that as I get older, I'm already thinking, I've seen my grandparents go through it. You've seen the same with your family. I want it to be a facility, if I go anywhere, that's a nice facility. If I can be at home, I would rather be at home. To have somebody take care of me from my home where my family can visit. These are things that you want to consider, and you don't want to get caught off guard. But the fear that people have is that, do I have enough to make it happen? Can I self-insure? Long-term care policies have come a long way. Originally, and we were talking about this, Joe's talked about it many times, but originally long-term care policies were written like life insurance policies. And life insurance policies typically have pretty low premiums because most people die without a life insurance policy. If it's a whole life policy or a term policy, they'll typically surrender the policy because they don't need it anymore. The need was no longer there. Or if it's a term policy, they just let it go out of it, go out of working for them anymore, and they just stop paying the premium. So what's different about long-term care is that people are probably going to use it. And so the policies that were written originally had a much lower premium. They made a whole lot more sense to buy. And people would, have benefited. We're seeing a lot of people currently benefiting from policies they bought in the late 90s. And, the people, they just can't believe how great policies they are, paying $4,000 to $6,000 a month for fees locked in. That, it's just a great thing. Working with a couple families right now that are trying to get that figured out. But now, if you go to buy a policy, actuarians have gotten a lot smarter. We have a lot more data on this. And the policies are very expensive. You're talking $4,000 to $6,000 a month of premiums to maintain a policy that can take care of you. That's a risk reward. Is that money better served being invested so that it can be piled up and used down the road? Or is it better off something that you are putting into the long-term care policy? It just depends. But I can tell you that everybody's, like we've said many times, everybody's situation is different. We want to make sure we look at what you have. We help you work through the decision. Do you have enough? We can look at data and say that typically men are going to be about 2.5 years if they're in a long-term care facility. Women more like 3.5 to 4. It's going to cost somewhere between $15,000 to $20,000 a month for those services. Can your assets hold up for that general amount of time? If we can do that and still not worry about dipping into other things, where you're dipping into assets that you're hoping to leave to your heirs, then it's probably a good choice to self-insure. But again, it's just dependent.
Absolutely. And like you were alluding to, back in the 90s, they were really beneficial long-term care policies. Like, they made sense. It made sense for your overall portfolio to be investing your money into this long-term care policy that's going to benefit you in the future. But like we always talk about, things change. Things are always changing. And this is one of the big things that has changed, because the actuaries realize that these long-term care policies are being paid out. They're
Yes.
not ones that people are paying into and then not using. So they've made big changes on what long-term care policies look like, how much they cost, and how they function. So today, when we're looking at a situation where it might make sense for somebody to need a long-term care policy, what are the options that they have available to them?
Yeah, so there's still plenty of companies that will sell you a long-term care sole policy, where it's just strictly for long-term care. But what's becoming more and more popular is a hybrid plan, where you buy a whole life insurance policy, a permanent life insurance policy, and then they put what's called an accelerated death benefit rider on there, where what that means is that if you meet a certain set of criteria based off of the policy, and they're all a little bit different, but all about the same too. If you meet a certain set of criteria, you actually get to start dipping into your death benefit that's been built up in that whole life policy. So instead of it being left behind, let's say it's a $500,000 death benefit, you can start actually using that to qualify for long-term care costs. The downside is that you don't have that $500,000 to leave to your beneficiaries. But at the same time, that's just icing on the cake for most people who buy these policies. They're saying, hey, if I can leave behind $500,000 to my beneficiaries, great. But also if I can not touch my other assets and draw down from this death benefit for my long-term care costs, I like that too. Still a product, depending on your age and situation, still not all of these things. You have to think they come with a cost. But it's definitely the more popular route that people are taking, and in my opinion, I think it makes the most sense as well. So
yeah, and one of the great benefits that we see with these hybrid policies is that when you have a traditional long-term care policy, if you don't use it, you just lose that benefit.
Yeah.
There is no death benefit. There's nothing that's left to your heirs. It's like homeowners insurance. You pay into the homeowners insurance. If you need it, it's there. If you don't, you don't get any benefit out of it. Exactly. It's gone. If you have this hybrid policy where you're buying the long-term care policy or the whole life insurance policy with the long-term care rider, well, then there is a benefit left to your heirs if you don't use it for long-term care. So that's just another benefit that we see, that it makes sense to do the hybrid over a traditional long-term care policy.
Yeah, and I've not personally worked with one. There are a few policies, long-term care policies that I've worked with recently. We have a family in Lafayette that they believe their children believe their mother should qualify. And one thing that most people don't know is when you get to that step of actually activating the long-term care, even the accelerated death benefit, there are criteria that have to be met, and you have to believe that the insurance company, they're not in a hurry to just approve everything to start sending money out of those policies. So it's a rigorous process that involves a doctor or somebody who can come in and check off a list to say, hey, yes, you qualify for this now. It's one more thing to really make sure every so often just brush up on those policies. Make sure you understand what's going to happen when that time comes to make a claim if you have one. Make sure you share it with your financial advisor. I know we always have our families share any life insurance, long-term care, any types of policies that we can have on file to make sure that we are aware of what to do so we can help them through that process if needed. But they're very complicated when it gets to that time, and it's unfortunate sometimes that you think you're ready to go, you make a claim, and then it doesn't necessarily mean that you get that money. There's normally a 30 to 90 day waiting period. So you might be in a facility for 90 days before you actually get to reimburse yourself. You might be in a facility for 90 days and then they say you don't qualify, and then now all that money's coming out of pocket. So really knowing those rules and being prepared for that's just one more thing to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the fears around the discussion of long-term care and if you should be buying a policy or self-insuring is that people have heard that if you go into a long-term care facility that you could just spend all of your money, lose it all to the long-term care facility, and have nothing left for your heirs. They go through what is known as the Medicaid spend down. So before you can qualify for Medicaid, you have to spend down all of your assets, and then Medicaid will kick in. What do we see with our families around this Medicaid spend down and really going through all of their assets?
We don't see it. We really don't. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen from time to time, but if you've accumulated enough, if you're somewhere, and you can't put a dollar figure on it depending on where you're at in the country, but if you haven't accumulated enough, you should be okay to finance the needs. Because if you're moving into a facility where you qualify to pay those fees, the likelihood of you being there for 5 to 10 years is just not very high. Sadly, if you're going to those facilities, it's probably going to be some of the last couple of years of your life, depending. So you have to remember that it's not a forever thing. This isn't like having something that needs to last another 30 years. This is a 5 years or less endeavor to have enough. We can do stress tests and say, hey, $400,000, if we took that immediately out, do you have enough to survive the next 20 years before you need that long-term care? You can do different things. We have software that can simulate those things to see if you're in good shape. But we just don't see it. Mm-hmm. We've seen some families. I know we had a family, you had a family that we talked about that did some Medicaid planning. There's some different things you can do legally to protect your assets. I know in my family, they've put a farm into an irrevocable trust about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. Thought it was a good move because they knew that my wife's grandfather would be probably moving into a facility soon. They didn't want the farm to be, exposed to Medicaid or to they didn't want it to be an asset that could be taken from. Mm-hmm. Made sense then, maybe not so much later. But in the end, there's different things you can do if you're really concerned. But in the end, it's a matter of just thinking about the facts of the situation, knowing how much you have, and if a plan needs to be made, making that plan as soon as possible, not reacting last minute.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like Darren alluded to, the plan that you want to put in place, if you think that if you want to prepare for a long-term care event, it's not always just buying a policy, right? It's making sure that you see the full picture. You see what assets you have. You see what options there are to protect those assets if there was a long-term care event, and you see if you can be self-insured from there going forward.
Right.
So that can be legacy planning, that can be trust planning, there's a lot of different things that go into what you can do to protect your assets against if there was a long-term care event. So these policies are just one of the options that you can look into when you're having these conversations. So this is something, again, that's ever changing. It's changing all the time. Prices are going up, but you do have options besides just buying a policy. And that's something that we can help talk you through. If you want to talk through this with an advisor here at Financial Enhancement Group, give us a call at 800-928-4001.